By 2007, the Middle East was a hotbed of conflict. The United States was fighting insurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon unilaterally withdrew the IDF and Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip. In 2006, the Gazans elected the terrorist group Hamas into power. Its militants conducted a cross-border raid into Israel, kidnapping an IDF member, which forced Israeli retaliation. The terrorist group Hezbollah triggered a similar response into Lebanon after it kidnapped IDF members, forcing Israel into a month-long invasion, to which Hezbollah responded by firing rockets into northern Israel. Sharon had resigned from office for health reasons in 2006, and was succeeded by his deputy prime minister Ehud Olmert, who was in charge during the Lebanon invasion. The ground war went poorly, and due to political pressures had to withdraw. Many expected him to resign, but he held out. On March 1, 2007, Meir Dagan, the director of Mossad, met with the prime minister to deliver some shocking news. Syria was only a year away from developing a nuclear weapon, and it would be pointed straight at Israel. The lead up to this discovery goes back several years. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq over its alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction. Once the US was able to successfully topple Saddam, fellow Arab dictator Muammar Gaddafi feared the same could happen to him. To eliminate any excuse for the US to invade, he revealed the existence of his own secret nuclear weapons program that he had been running for decades, and offered to dismantle it in exchange for security guarantees for his regime. When this was made public in late 2003, Israeli intelligence was caught off guard. They had been completely unaware of its existence, and considering Gaddafi had a history of sponsoring Palestinian terrorism, it was considered a catastrophic intelligence failure. This resulted in Israel's intelligence agencies, Mossad and Amman, to redouble their efforts into hunting down any and all possible nuclear ties that might be hiding in the region. Israel has 3 intelligence agencies. The most famous is Mossad, which is their equivalent to the CIA, and whose prowess is also overblown. Then there is Shin Bet, which is the Internal Security Service, which is kind of like Homeland Security. And then there is Amman, which is military intelligence. They are mostly focused on acquiring intelligence on foreign militaries, with its primary targets being Israel's immediate neighbors, so Syria is its most frequent concern. But back in the mid-2000s, Israel's attention was directed at the Islamic Republic of Iran, who for decades has been openly hostile to Israel and advocated its destruction. They were close allies of the Syrian regime and had become sponsors of terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. But it was Iran's nuclear ambitions that frightened both Israel and the US. The story of Iran's nuclear program deserves a video of its own, but the short version is that Iran originally obtained nuclear reactors in the 1960s through the Atoms for Peace initiative under Mohammad Reza Shah. After the Iranian Revolution, the US stopped providing aid for Iran's nuclear program, and most of Iran's nuclear scientists fled the country, especially because Ayatollah Khomeini distrusted nuclear energy and weapons as Western innovations. But this changed after the Iran-Iraq War. His successor, Khamenei, would publicly revive its nuclear energy program while covertly beginning its own weapons program. This program was exposed in 2002, which added to the overall fear of spreading WMDs at the time. Because of this, Mossad was mostly focused on gathering intelligence about Iran and its program, but Amman would do its due diligence in gathering intelligence about Syria. They became interested in Ibrahim Othman, the director of the Syrian Atomic Energy Commission. Syria had signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so they weren't expected to possess a weapons program of their own. But after Gaddafi's revelations, you couldn't be too careful. In January 2007, a meeting of the International Atomic Energy Association brought Othman to Vienna. Well, Amman wanted to extract some information from him, but Amman doesn't usually travel that far, and so this became a joint operation between Amman and Mossad. Othman was at a bar speaking with a woman who, unbeknownst to him, was a Mossad agent. She and a team of other Mossad would keep him distracted while Amman would break into his hotel room and gather as much intelligence as they could. They found a metal briefcase and took pictures of every document and photo inside of it, not checking to see what was even on it. And once they brought this information back to Israel, it didn't get analyzed for several weeks because Syria was a low priority target compared to Iran at the time. But as soon as they did, Meir Dagan made it his highest priority. Mossad and Amman continued to gather intelligence in order to put together a fuller picture of Syria's weapons program. Syria was ruled by the Assads, who came to power in a coup led by Hafez al-Assad back in 1970. Hafez had considered creating a nuclear program, but he decided not to risk it, wanting to avoid giving Israel an excuse to attack them unprovoked. Hafez had been a military man and had groomed his son Basil to succeed him, but Basil would die in a car crash in 1994, while his brother, Bashar, was in England attending medical school to be an optometrist. Bashar would return to Syria and be given a crash course in military dictatorship. Hafez had been against starting a nuclear program, but Bashar was more open to it. The exact start date for the program is unclear, but the analysts were certain that it started after Bashar was made Hafez's successor, possibly as early as 1997, and no later than 2001. Bashar was a conspiracist who believed Mossad agents were hiding behind every corner and intercepting every piece of electronic communication. He was so paranoid that he set up his own shadow military separate from the formal establishment that answered directly to him and only communicated in handwritten messages delivered in envelopes sealed with wax. Because of this low-tech approach, he was able to keep the construction of a reactor facility secret from the outside world. The Israelis' research uncovered some strange connections within Syria's weapons program, and there was only one country they knew who could fill in the gaps and be trusted with the intelligence they had just gathered. On a trip to Israel in mid-April, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates would meet with Meir Dagan, becoming the first U.S. official to learn about Syria's reactor.
This was a significant failure on the part of the U.S. intelligence agencies, and I asked the president, how can we have any confidence at all in the estimates of the scope of the North Korean, Iranian, and other programs given this failure? Surprisingly, neither the president nor Congress made much of it. Given the stakes, they should have.
A meeting between Meir Dagan and U.S. officials in Washington was quickly set up. Dagan would meet with National Security Advisor Steve Hadley and Vice President Dick Cheney, which was highly unusual. Normally, when an intelligence agent meets with a foreign official, they only reveal classified information in the presence of their own head of state or government. But this situation was considered so dire that that protocol was ignored. Dagan showed Hadley and Cheney all the documents and photos they had. The site was in northeastern Syria, near a town called Al-Kibar. It was built in a dune, so it would be out of sight from the nearby highway. The outside had a rough constructed exterior made to look like an abandoned Ottoman-era fort. Cheney looked at the photos and noticed something peculiar.
Important clues about the reactor's intended purpose came from what photographs didn't show. There were no power lines coming out of it, none of the switching facilities that would be present. If its purpose were to produce electricity, it was not near any power grid.
But what really confused Cheney and Hadley was the design of the reactor site. This was an uncommon style pioneered by the British, but not used anywhere since the 1960s, except in one country: North Korea. The North Korean nuclear program is also worthy of its own video, but here's what we need to know for this video. The Bush administration had been working on getting the North Koreans to give up their weapons program. Part of this early agreement was the North Koreans shutting down and dismantling one of their known reactors at Yongbyon.
Rendering inoperable the North Koreans' plutonium production capacity was a significant achievement, as we were worried that they might transfer the material to others.
But on October 8, 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test at Punggye, 200 miles northeast of Pyongyang, violating its previous agreements with the US and the international community. They had the technology, and fear of wider nuclear proliferation spread. The photos collected from Othman and other sources show Syrian atomic officials meeting with North Koreans. There was also evidence of mysterious sporadic shipments between the two countries. After being shown everything Dagan had, Cheney and Hadley decided that President Bush needed to see it. They brought it to him, and Dagan laid out the evidence again. The US requested copies of the information so that they could confirm everything they had found themselves, to which Dagan complied. The plot had thickened. A Syrian weapons program being built by the North Koreans was sufficiently international, and Vice President Cheney, who had wanted Syria to be added to Bush's axis of evil speech, felt vindicated. US intelligence would continue investigating the site themselves, confirming most of what the Israelis had found and uncovering further developments themselves.
In early June, we could see in imagery that the Syrians were gouging out a cooling water intake along the banks of the river, and were digging 2 trenches up the wadi for pipes to bring cold water to the facility and discharge hot water back to the river. The building still looked like a Walmart warehouse from above, but there was nothing other than a nuclear reactor that could create enough heat to warrant that kind of cooling. And the fact that the Syrians opted for the low-profile underground pipes and cooling system rather than the large cooling towers fit the clandestine nature of the facility.
Prime Minister Olmert had talked with President Bush and had wanted the facility destroyed and asked if the U.S. would do it. And the U.S. certainly had the ability. Between aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, an ally in Turkey, and its ongoing occupation of Iraq, it was certainly in a position strategically to do it. But President Bush and his administration were concerned with the optics. The U.S. was already bogged down in 2 wars in Islamic countries, and one of them was based on allegations of them possessing weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be false. Syria was also a sore spot in the Iraq War. A majority of the foreign fighters found in Iraq had come into the country through Syria, evidenced by their passports. The president wanted to be absolutely certain that this site was for a nuclear weapons program, so he got CIA Director Michael Hayden to investigate, and in particular, to create a team whose specific intention was to come up with alternative explanations. He wanted to avoid the groupthink that led to the invasion of Iraq. They studied every piece of evidence and came up with every possible explanation, likely or not. They even went so far as to propose that it might be a fake reactor. Eventually, whether to act or not came down to a specific criteria. Where was the reactor's core? The policy shorthand becoming, no core, no war. The final policy meeting took place in June 2007, in which President Bush took in the evidence, advice, and suggestions from his intelligence and security officials.
Mr. President, we got 4 key findings for you. 1, that's a nuclear reactor. 2, it's clear that the North Koreans and Syrians have been cooperating on nuclear question for about a decade. 3, North Koreans built this thing. And 4, this is part of a nuclear weapons program.
However, as it had become policy since Iraq, each of them had to give their confidence levels on their assessments. Hayden had high confidence that it was indeed a nuclear reactor, and that the North Koreans were helping the Syrians. They were also confident that this was a copy of the Yongbyon reactor they had shut down. Where he was less confident was the weapons program. The way the reactor site was constructed showed that it could not have been part of an energy program. If it was for energy, they would have constructed it closer to the power grid, and it would have used cooling towers rather than piping water in from the Euphrates. The problem, however, was that the site was missing a facility for enrichment, which was essential for a weapons program.
But, Mr. President, I can't find the other parts of a weapons program. No reprocessing facility, no weaponization effort that we can see, so I can only give this to you with low confidence.
Despite the low confidence of the weapons aspect of the nuclear program, Vice President Cheney advocated for a military strike. He argued that such a strike would not just eliminate the Syrian threat, but also send a warning to Iran and North Korea about their own programs. He also advocated for expanding the attack to hit weapons depots in Syria in order to weaken their support for Hezbollah in Lebanon. However, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Defense Secretary Robert Gates were skeptical of the efficacy of such an attack.
The North Koreans were already heavily sanctioned, and still they had detonated a nuclear device and proliferated nuclear knowledge to Syria. The idea that we could bomb the Syrian reactor to make a point about proliferation in the face of uncertain intelligence was, to put it mildly, reckless.
After hearing all the evidence, President Bush decided to go with the diplomatic route suggested by Rice and Gates.
The Air Force could destroy the target, no sweat, but bombing a sovereign country with no warning or announced justification would create severe blowback.
Rice's plan called for going to the UN and IAEA and exposing Syria's nuclear program, and demanding an inspection similar to what happened in the lead-up to Iraq, but this time with much greater evidence and support. If the Syrians complied, they could disarm the program without starting another war, and if they refused, they always had military action to fall back on. Exposing the program like this, Rice believed, would also put greater pressure on North Korea and hopefully restore the US's reputation after Iraq. There were also concerns about the sourcing of the information.
Bush would have to justify any military action to Congress, and the first thing he would be asked would be on what intelligence the action was based. The moment he revealed the source as being Israeli, the entire world would pounce on the United States for taking action against an Arab country because of Israel.
But Olmert and the Israelis were not happy with this decision. They feared that the program was on a faster track to completion than the US did. They also feared, and rightfully so, that if the program was exposed, within a couple days the Assad regime would build a makeshift school or hospital at the site and bus in children or patients, making an attack on the facility impossible without civilian casualties. This is exactly what groups like Hezbollah and Hamas had a history of doing, and if they waited until after the reactor was active, attacking it would cause a humanitarian and environmental disaster.
It was located about half a mile from the Euphrates River, and if we attacked it after it was activated, the result would be a potential cataclysm affecting hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people who lived nearby or downstream. Never in history was a hot reactor, uranium or plutonium, bombed, and we had no intention of being the first to do so.
The bottom line was, the Syrian regime was openly hostile and had tried to destroy the state of Israel on multiple occasions, and no prime minister of Israel in Olmert's shoes would allow it to go that far.
Excuse me, Mr. President. I understand that the US will not take military action, and while I respect your reasons, we will do what is necessary.
President Bush admired Olmert, and had so since before either of them were national leaders.
I love Ehud so much. He is such a courageous man.
A moment later, Bush stunned his aides a second time.
I am charging you with following Israel's every move and ensuring that no official from this administration does anything to interfere.
Indeed, the help and support I received from Bush throughout the whole process was unparalleled.
The Americans weren't the only ones having trouble deciding on a course of action. During many of the cabinet debates, Ehud Barak, the defense minister and head of the Labour Party, opposed attacking the reactor before it was active. Barak became so intransigent that during a meeting where one of his subordinates was presenting gathered intelligence and military options, he shouted at him to stop, claiming that he had the authority to do so based on his position as defense minister, to which Olmert responded by picking up where the subordinate had stopped, and told Barak,
"Sit down and listen. The Prime Minister is doing the talking now."
Olmert had taken a beating in the press for the Second Lebanon War a year earlier, and there was a fear that the press and international community would interpret a strike on Syria as the Prime Minister trying to rescue his reputation. But leaving the reactor in Syria's hands was a risk Olmert wasn't willing to tolerate, so he reached out to former prime ministers for advice, which led to Ehud Barak, a former prime minister himself, joining the cabinet. He also reached out to Benjamin Netanyahu, who supported Olmert's decision for a military strike. A surprising stumbling block early on was President Shimon Peres. Not only was he a former prime minister, but prior to that he had been Director General of the Ministry of Defense, who had helped plan the Israeli invasion of the Suez in 1956, and had been instrumental in the establishment of Israel's own nuclear program, Project Dimona.
Peres, on the other hand, reacted a bit bizarrely. He was very tense and focused on technical questions. What kind of output was the reactor capable of? How exactly would the Syrians deliver a nuclear bomb? Via missiles? Perhaps, he suggested, we could strike a deal with them.
After several months of herding cats, he finally got the highest level members of his cabinet on board with the attack. Orchestrating the plan would be Major General Amos Yadlin. He was an Israeli Air Force pilot who not only served in the Yom Kippur War, but more importantly had participated in Operation Opera in 1981, in which the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq. Much of the world, including President Reagan, condemned Israel for the attack because, at the time, the US and much of the West was supporting Saddam's regime in its war with Iran. That attack created what is now known as the Begin Doctrine, named for Israel's prime minister at the time. It was a policy that called for Israel to use whatever means necessary to destroy the nuclear capability of any hostile regime, which included Assad's Syria. The operation itself, so long as it could be kept secret, was easy enough. The Air Force began running drills flying over the eastern Mediterranean, not knowing what their final mission would actually be. At this same time, Olmert's government had been in secret peace talks with Syria via President Erdogan of Turkey, but time was running out. In a secret speech given to the Syrian parliament, Assad spoke in vague terms about 2007 being a fateful year, and that, over the next few months, the fate of the region and of the entire world will be cemented. The key to the success of this mission, codenamed Operation Orchard, was secrecy on part of the Israelis. and deniability on the part of Assad. If Israel had destroyed the reactor in broad daylight and then told the world about what it did, this would put Assad into a humiliating position abroad and might even put threats to his regime at home. And so he would be forced to retaliate against Israel, which would then force a counter-response from Israel, which could then embroil the entire region into a war. This is why Olmert had wanted the US to attack the reactor instead of themselves. The US was already on a war footing in the region, and Syria would be less likely to retaliate against the United States than they were against Israel. But at this point, that was no longer an option. Despite everything riding on the success of the mission, he believed they could complete it while avoiding war, creating what they called the deniability window. The reactor was not just a secret to the international community, but also to most of the Syrian government. This program was operating under Bashar's shadow military, which communicated on handwritten notes and answered directly to him, so no one outside of that command structure knew about it. On top of that, Syria had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If Israel destroyed the reactor and Syria responded militarily, it would expose them as having violated the treaty, which would create international pressure on the regime. It was narrow, but so long as Israel could provide Assad with this deniability window, Olmert was certain war would be avoided. The day before the attack, September 5th, had to look like any other day. Olmert and the ministers and generals who were in on the plan were required to continue their normal schedules in order to avoid suspicion in the press. In the early hours of Thursday, September 6, 2007, the mission would start. At 3 a.m., a group of F-151s took off from Ramat David Air Base in northern Israel. They initially kept to their standard flight elevation so as not to alert the various Arab intelligence services that monitored the Israeli skies. They flew out over the Mediterranean. 7 of them would break off from the formation and head north. These 7 pilots had just been informed about their mission prior to takeoff, and they turned eastward and began flying along Turkey's southern border with Syria. As they neared Al-Kabar, they crossed the border into Syrian airspace. 22 missiles were fired into the complex, destroying the reactor and all the facilities needed for it to run. Using Erdogan as a go-between, Olmert sent a message to Assad, telling him that if he stayed quiet, so would Israel. About an hour later, the Syrian government announced that an attempted attack by Israel had failed, and that Israeli jets had been shot down by Syrian air defense. It was clear that Assad had chosen to crawl through the deniability window. Olmert would call President Bush. He was enthusiastic and offered Israel any support it needed if things went hot. But luckily for everyone, it didn't. Although everybody was relieved by the results, some were not happy with Israel's actions. Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates were still upset about the missed opportunity to place international pressure on North Korea. Condoleezza Rice had wanted to pursue a strategy of making Israel so dependent on the US that it had to take orders from the president. Gates was mostly afraid that preemptive warfare, without warning, would become the international norm. Olmert's government was sworn to secrecy about the attacks, but the Bush administration was legally obligated to inform Congress of significant intelligence activities. Prior to the attacks, the ranking members of the Foreign Intelligence Committees were informed, but told that they could not speak about it publicly. In April of 2008, the administration came out with a report on the attack that would be the most comprehensive until Israel published its own materials a decade later. After the attack, US spy planes spotted North Koreans inspecting the site, sifting through the rubble. The attack uncovered parts of the facility that had been hidden, which revealed some of the missing components, proving that it was in fact a weapons program. And after its own investigation, in April 2011, the IAEA officially confirmed that it was in fact a nuclear reactor site. Despite the attacks, the secret talks between Israel and Syria continued, but they fell apart in December 2008. Olmert had flown to Turkey where, the next day, he and Assad with Erdogan would announce a new framework for a peace between Israel and Syria. Doing this, Olmert hoped, would pull Syria out of the Iranian camp, thereby weakening them in the region. Unfortunately, the night before, Assad wanted to make a last-minute change to the agreement by phone. He demanded that Israel withdraw from the Golan Heights and return the territory to Syria. This was not an option for Olmert or any Israeli prime minister. At no point in the negotiations had handing over the Golans been discussed, and both sides knew it was a poison pill. The deal was dead in the water. Olmert stepped down from the prime ministership in early 2009 in order to deal with corruption charges against him, for which he would eventually serve time in prison. Parliamentary elections held in February 2009 brought Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party back to power. The consequences of this event are immense. Had Israel done nothing, the world, or at the very least the Middle East, could be drastically different. It seems very possible that the North Koreans were using Syria as an external site for their own nuclear tests. North Korea at the time had been working with both Syria and Iran on missile technology. If Syria had successfully created its own nuclear weapon, this essentially gives Iran access to one as well, which has been a major security concern not just for the region, but for the world as a whole. There was also the problem of the oncoming Arab Spring. Having nuclear weapons doesn't make a country immune to political instability. Just look at Pakistan. Imagine what would happen if Assad had access to nukes during the Syrian civil war. Or even worse, what if an Islamist group got access to it? This was a real possibility. In fact, in 2014, ISIS captured the site near Al-Kibar, where the reactor had been. ISIS were, and still are, an apocalyptic death cult that believes it can hasten the end of days by creating chaos and bloodshed. Nuclear war would have been the inevitable result. I also want to take a moment to comment on the conduct of the Bush administration during this event. If you are in your late 20s or early 30s, then chances are you spent most of your teen years during Bush's presidency. I remember at the time, especially after Iraq, how George W. Bush and the members of his administration were portrayed as either evil, lying, money-grubbing warmongers or as incompetent idiots. Now, I never felt that way at the time, but those were the two most popular takes, even though they can't both simultaneously be true. But after doing all the research for this and a little more I've been doing behind the scenes, I have found a new appreciation for President Bush and his administration. They acknowledged that they made mistakes in the lead up to the Iraq War, and they did everything within their power to avoid making them again. This was a president who learned from his failures and made up for it by changing the way he acted in the future, unlike many other presidents who would simply plow forward with their bad habits, insisting that it's everyone else who is wrong, and that everyone else was just too stupid to get their brilliant plans. I want to take a quick moment to thank my patrons. Things are tight for everybody right now, and I cannot thank you guys enough for giving me a little more breathing room to help me spend more time making these videos to educate and entertain anyone who finds them of use. If you really appreciate my videos and have the means to help support me, then I would recommend going to patreon.com/casualhistorian, finding a tier that is right for you and contributing at that tier. And if you can't afford to support monetarily, that's perfectly understandable. But you could also subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon, click the like button, and share the video. Those are all help a lot, as well as commenting. It tells the algorithm that this video has a lot of engagement and is worth sharing. So once again, thank you so much to patrons for helping make this video possible, and thanks to all of you for watching. I will see you next time.